This video, we are going to talk about being wise as serpents while operating in the private domain. We're going to talk about how this plays into case law and taxes. It's that season. Everybody, I hope, is thinking about the wisest way to approach this with your ministry and your private associations. So to help me navigate through this topic, joining me is one of the most thoughtful and discerning and wise people I know, my friend and fellow PMA Power Advisor, Guy Stinson. Guy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And as you can probably see, my cat, whenever I talk, he comes on the show as well. He wants to be part of the conversation. Yeah. If I don't allow him to, he howls in the background and that's been a noise. So this is moderator that we have here.
This is our moderator. Yeah.
Absolutely. First of all, I think before we dive into this, just as usual, we are not lawyers, we're not attorneys, we're not tax advisors, but we are people that are on a journey of discovery, as we all are. And as we look for something and we discover things, then obviously, if you're a good person, you want to help other people and share that with them. And I was thinking about it this morning. What I was thinking of is we are like people walking through a desert. And everybody's thirsty and everybody's starving and everybody's being beaten by the sun. And lo and behold, you find a spring of water, right? Now, what is the good and the right thing to do? The good and the right thing to do is to say, hey, my thirsty brothers and sisters, I found water. This is a good thing. Doesn't mean I'm a geologist. It doesn't mean, I'm a scientist or a biologist or a whatever. It means I found water and this is refreshing my soul. And so we're not coming here as some sort of legal expertise. And by the way, just as a disclaimer there, if you have issues of importance, please speak to the people that have the relevant expertise to help you through those situations. So that out of the way, my cat agrees. Let's dive into this. You were talking about a case that came up recently, and I think that's part of what has prompted this. And this was a case that was held in Arizona. I'm not going to go into details of it. I tend to think in concept. It's the way my mind works.
Yeah, and I'll post the link to the case too, so people watching can.
Excellent. So what happens is that when you come into an arena like this, where you have the subject of PMAs and you have overreach and you have people are taking offense now and saying, whoa, we've got to rally the troops and so on. What I see is it tends to set a mindset, which is often not the appropriate mindset. And if you adopt that as your foundation, then the house you build on that mindset has problems and runs into issues. It's a bit like Jesus talking about the house that is built on sand or on the rock. Everything looks fine until the storm comes. And so in the case, this was an example because there was a case in Arizona where a couple were running a PMA as a ministry and they had taken the vow of poverty. And in the vow of poverty, which is well known in Catholic circles, the person who's the minister says, I want nothing for myself because everything is in service of God. And therefore, I'm going to put my house, my possessions, everything into the ministry. And by the way, since it's in ministry, Congress shall make no law with regard to ministry and, religion, the free exercise thereof. So therefore, government, you can't touch it, right?
Right.
Now, when somebody comes to me and says, Guy, talk to me about PMAs, I want to be in a ministry. The first thing I do is I test them for authenticity. And the reason for that is because if you are not authentic and you get challenged in court, it is super easy for a judge to see you're a fake.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Now, if you are authentic, what happens? There is something about your relationship with God and the Holy Spirit that empowers you. It empowers you to know what to say. It gives you solidity. It gives you a foundation. It gives you backbone. So if you are authentic, what is in you comes out of your mouth.
Right.
And so if you stand in front of the court and the court says, okay, now you claim to be a ministry, Well, the defense of that is natural, automatic, because it's part of your DNA. That makes sense, right? But without that, it becomes super easy to say, I'm sorry, but this is smoke and mirrors, and you are not authentic, and we're going to rule against you. So for me, that's criteria number one. And so I always test people coming to me to see if is there authenticity. Are you living your conviction? Is it evident? Is it coming out of your language? Are you publishing? Do you have a congregation? And the iris, by the way, also tests for authenticity. And so how does it do that? It has a list, for example. If you claim to be a church, we are going to measure you against this list to see if you're authentic. And it has like a 12-point list or so on, right, to see if people are actually genuine and authentic. And if they're not, then it says, well, tough luck. We don't believe you. We're going to rule against you.
Right.
So it's super important. And what I see in this case is now these people may have had genuine intention. It may have been a case of they were misled in the first place or whatever. So right, we're not going to stand in judgment of them, but I'm just saying, looking at this case, this is what comes to the surface for me, and these are the things I see.
Okay.
So authenticity is super important. Now, when we come to PMAs, maybe we can talk about this a little bit later, but if you start building a house on a foundation which is not authentic, then the house begins to creak and to wobble. And when the storm comes, like the court case, guess what? The house falls. And unfortunately, when the house falls, it catches the headlines, and especially in the PMA communities or people considering PMA say, oh, look at that, the house has fallen. But what they don't understand is why it fell.
Right.
And what the issues are. And one of the issues is that when you don't stand on an authentic foundation, you can't be strong, number one. Number two is when you stand on a foundation you have no rights to stand on, you can't be strong.
Right.
Okay. And I keep on emphasizing this, that PMAs do not erase pre-existing rights and obligations that others have.
Yep.
And that is so important to understand, because you can think of it this way. Imagine a farmer's got a great farm out in the countryside, and it's got beautiful views, and it's got a nice fishing pond and so on. And you turn up and you're just going to say, I'm going to pitch my tent, and you put a fence around the tent and you start fishing in his pond. Right? And he comes to you and he knocks on your tent and he says, what are you doing here? He says, well, this is private domain. This is my tent, and I'm going to stick here and you can get lost, right? Okay, I mean, you can see the absurdity of that, right? So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is the farmer is going to appeal to a higher authority, and the higher authority is going to pull you into the court, going to send the law enforcement officials after you. They're going to pull you into court. And again, they're going to look at you, are you authentic? Right? So the idea of a PMA is like a magic wand that erases everything and erases all of the problems and erases the powers and the rights of other people is actually a false notion. And we need to understand that. So you have a couple like this gets into court and they're being challenged and they're saying, well, you don't have the right to tax us, you don't have the right to this, you don't have the right to that, and so on and so forth. And judge says, why? Because you're a ministry, we're a PMA, and it's private. All right. Yeah, but you're squatting on our territory, says the IRS, or you're squatting on our territory, says the county.
Yeah.
You know, we were here long before you were.
Right.
We had the rights long before you got here. So these are things that undermine people when it comes to court cases and so on. Unfortunately, there's a Wild West thing going on out there where, you know, buy a PMA, it's your magic wand, and everything is hunky-dory. No, it's not. I had somebody contact me recently and say, we started a ministry, we bought ourselves this beautiful entertainment place, and now the fire marshal wants to come and do an inspection. So we told him, get lost, this is private, you know, this, okay. And I look at this, but number one, he was there long before you. There's county rules in place, there's ordinances, there's compacts of safety with the community. There's all of these things in place. your tent squatting on somebody else's pre-existing territory does not erase the rights and privileges.
Right.
So you see this in the court. Another problem that people get into is they hand over the reins of what would be their protection to another authority.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you own a horse and you love the horse, right? The horse is great.
Yeah.
Okay. But somebody comes along and says, hey, I want your horse. And you say to him, sure, here's the reins, take it. Well, then to cry about the fact that he's riding your horse after the event is not going to help you.
Right.
You gave him the reins to your horse. You gave him the saddle, and now he's riding your horse. And I'm using that as an analogy because this happens a lot of times going into court.
Mm-hmm.
When you sign up, for example, with the state for something the state actually creates as an entity,
yep,
you need to be so careful of the wording that's used in legal terminology. For example, the state will say to you, please submit an application to be a LLC or a corporation or a this or a that or the other thing. Well, what happens? When you apply for something, number one, you're acknowledging this does not belong to me.
Mm-hmm.
If it belonged to me, I wouldn't have to apply for it. Right? It's kind of common sense, okay? But, so I'm going to apply for it, which means I'm going to ask you, state, for permission to use that which belongs to you. And then what do? Well, you fill out a form, you put your sign on it, your signature on it, as a sign that you are applying, as a sign that you are entering into this relationship. Mm-hmm. And then what do? You submit it to the owner of, or the constructor of that relationship. So it just gets super interesting because when you dive into that again, the word submit is what? It's a military term. Mm. So what did kings do in the old days when they conquered people? They said, I have won, I'm going to stand on your neck now, and I'm going to take all authority over you, and you must submit to me. So when we submit, we are giving up our power and authority, we are submitting. And by the way, don't take this too literally, but it's implied in the dynamic of it, right? Because there are cases where you submit things and that's fine, but these things can also bite you in a way.
Right.
So anyhow, so you submit and then you ask for permission to use that which belongs to another.
Right.
And that's what happens when you submit an application for a corporation or any entity created by the soul, by the state, even a corporate soul, which is what these people were using.
Right.
So what you'll do is
just to clarify, that's where they submitted, they asked for permission, they became part of the state's laws and rules and regulations. And I don't remember exactly how you said it, but now they've just entered into something that was already there. They're on the farm, they're on the farmer's land by doing that.
Pre-existing rights and obligations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've submitted, in other words, you now are in that slave relationship to the victor. So it's victorious and less, I won't say victim because that's not that could touch a nerve.
Yeah.
But you're in this relationship where they are the authority and they have jurisdiction and they have control and they set the terms and conditions. He who creates the terms and conditions is master of those terms and conditions. So now they go in. So what I saw in this case was a whole lot of points where they were disconnected from what I perceive is the role of PMAs and where PMA should be.
Right.
And when you're disconnected, then you have a problem in a court situation. You're a house in sand and you have this problem with a storm that comes against you.
Right.
So Jesus says we need to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. And that means that we need to understand where these things are in right relationship. And so the question then is, well, what is a PMA and why does it actually serve you at all? And I think a lot of people get mixed up about this because they're trying to push things into PMAs that PMAs are not at all. For
Nice.
example, they're trying to push in sometimes the ministries you spoke about when they're not authentic. Shouldn't be in a PMA. They're trying to push in all sorts of things which actually belong to others into the PMA, which shouldn't be in the PMA, and so on. And that gets them into trouble because now they're going to court. And if I go, for example, to your house, I see on the wall you've got some nice pictures and murals, and I go and take the mural from you. I come in and I'll put it in my tent on the farmer's yard next to the fishing pole. Obviously, you're going to come back and say, but hey, that is mine. I want mine. Give me what belongs to me. And Jesus tells us to pay to Caesar, or to give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and to God that which belongs to God. So if we are taking your pictures and putting it in my PMA tent, obviously you're going to say, that's mine, give it back to me. Right? If we do the same thing with the IRS, obviously the IRS is going to say, that's my money, give it back to me. Right?
Yeah, so that was the second thing in this case. So the first was they did a lot of funny little things that caused the disconnection, the main one being that they registered as a corporation sole. So even though they were using tax code 508C1A and stating that they're a ministry and stating that they'd taken this vow of poverty, they were disconnected from the true purpose, as well as then they made a mistake by not filing, which the IRS found they ruled against them. And because, and this was the big thing when I dug into this case, they were in complete control of the ministry funds, their ministry, their corporated ministry, the ministry funds, as well as their personal funds. There was no distinction between the two. So Caesar said, no, you do owe us something. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there were a whole lot of little points there that's kind of like a snowball accumulated to the judgment. And it was, I looked at that and it was like, the judge would have been unfair, I think, if he said, based on just one of those points, I'm going to rule against you. But when you started putting them together, it started building this really big snowball, this really big avalanche, which came down on them. And so, for example, you mentioned the corporate soul. Well, that is an entity. Again, you apply for state for that recognition.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a corporation. It's a corporate soul. It's run by soul individuals. So there you've got this relationship, and yet you're claiming to be independent, but you've got this relationship tying into that. So you're not actually. Second thing is that with their income, they were selling product, and there was obviously an exchange, product for a set fee, right?
Right.
So that, again, the judge could have said, well, look, I'm prepared to overlook that. But when you start adding them together, it starts becoming, no, this whole thing is not authentic. Then what they were doing is they were putting that money into the corporate soul account, said, hey, this is religion, this is a ministry, so hands off IRS. And the IRS said, but yes, there's no distinction. You have set up the ministry, you own the ministry, so you're putting the money into the ministry, pulling it straight out into your own pockets, and you running a scam, effectively.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that judges and IRS and government officials have a job to do. It's their duty to probe and to prod and to see if you're authentic.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be offended, when they do that. Our defense is, are we legitimate? Are we true? Are we doing things the right way?
Right.
Okay.
Real quick, when I dug into the case, because first my personality is I read through it really quick. A corporation soul doesn't apply to us. Then on a relook on further research, which is not easy for me because I'm still delving into this legalese land and the language, but I sat myself down and said, okay, what are they really saying here? And there was one sentence from it that really summed it up. And it said, as long as the individual taxpayer, which is the purported agent, remains as a practical matter in complete control over the income,
right.
After it is transferred to the church, which is the purported principle, it is income to the individual. So it was like this. There was only two of them. It was a husband and wife team. There was no board of directors, no advisory board, no other trustees. So it really was these two individuals back and forth, but saying we owe nothing. And the reason this was really, really important to me is because if I had not been paying tax responsibility, which I've continued to do, everybody knows, then I would have been really concerned about myself and people who may have not listened to what we've all told them that says, you have research to do, you have choices to make, and you need to know what you're doing. You need to talk to the proper individuals, the proper experts, in order to know what your responsibility is to Caesar. So this to me is one of the most important videos that we can make, so that people say, oh, wow, I have further research to do so that I'm not doing the same thing. If I'm a one-person show in my ministry or association, assuming they're all private, that's me plus my trustees, it's going in the same place. And we want to make sure that you are looking at the way that this could or needs to be researched and done.
Right.
Okay.
Right, absolutely. And this is so important because people get themselves into trouble when they don't have to.
Right.
And it's so important. And also something I've observed, which is always a sad case, whenever something good comes along, there's always this noise that goes into the market, and you get the Wild West characters that go out and promise the earth, right? The gold diggers.
Right.
Unfortunately, we are seeing some people get really hurt by that, and that's not where we want to stand at all. So the principles, as I said, PMAs don't erase pre-existing rights and obligations. And unfortunately, when that's laid as a foundation, as this is going to make your troubles go away and it's rock solid. Well, yes, it is when it's used the right way, but it's not rock solid when you're ducking and diving and stepping over other people's boundaries and pitching your tents next to the farmer's land and so on. Absolutely not. It's not going to protect you in the slightest if that is it. So it has to be done the right way. And that is so important. And Jesus indicated this as well. So when people come along and waving the flag of, hey, you don't have to pay taxes here, and PMA is your answer to do that. Well, there are situations in which that would be true, but to package it like that, I think, is somewhat dubious,
right?
To put it mildly, right?
Right.
But Jesus, for example, recognized this principle. He goes to Peter because the tax collectors came to Peter and said, does your master pay taxes? So Jesus says to Peter, should the children of the king pay taxes? Are they under obligation to? Peter says no. Jesus says you're absolutely right. The children of the king do not need to pay taxes. There's no obligation on them to pay taxes. However, so that we can live in peace, go to fish and you will find in the mouth of the fish there'll be a coin, and pay the taxes with that. So what he's saying is we need to be in the world, but not of the world. We need to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves, right?
Right.
And sometimes it's advantageous to give to Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God, which is God's.
Right.
And so don't resent Caesar, because if you are right in giving to Caesar, you will be right with God.
Mm-hmm.
And God can make up any shortfall. 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. What you give to Caesar, God can make up 10,000 times. It shouldn't even be a concern to us in a sense, right?
Right.
And yes, I know there are exceptions to this, but I'm just addressing a mentality that is getting people into trouble.
Right.
So sometimes you will look at your taxes, and this is my situation where I say, look, I actually believe in the road I drive in was paid with taxes. The lights and the water were paid with taxes. I believe in paying taxes. Now, I don't believe in the abuse of taxes, but I do believe in paying taxes. So I know I could set up a ministry. I know I could stand in the ministry. I'm authentic. I can defend that, right, in a court.
Right.
But do I really want the stress of going through that battle?
Mm-hmm.
Do I really want to sleep at night waiting for the knock on the door to wake me up in the wee hours, right? Do I really want that? Do I not trust God to make the shortfall? So for me, it makes sense to live in peace with Caesar and pay your taxes, right? So that's just my perspective. And I can see there are times that as the ministry gets more substantial, it may make sense to change position on that for practical reasons. So I think just to one concept I'd like to bring into this before we wrap this up. And so that is, what is a PMA? And a PMA is presented in a way that it sounds all complicated. And I see people struggling with this, just struggling and struggling and struggling with the concept of it. But a PMA is nothing more than a contract. That's all it is. It's a contract amongst individuals. And in the contract, we say to each other, we are going to enter a relationship with each other, which is going to be governed by this contract. So the contract is between me, you, whoever's in the PMA. And it's a private contract. And in the contract, we write the terms and the conditions of a contract. Like any other contract, this group will function in private. This will be the boundaries of it. These will be the obligations. This is how we will settle matters, and so forth. That's all a PMA is. And yes, there's a little bit more to it, because you obviously you want to avoid certain legal language that would tie you into relationships that are not healthy for the PMA. But that's all it is. It's just a contract to say, hey, when we get together, we are going to do business subject to this contract.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so once you've got that, you've got your contract, you've got your private domain, you've got ministry, and I prefer to see them as three different things. Now, a ministry can bring a PMA into it. So, for example, a ministry functions as a ministry, but the ministry may say, well, what about our relationships member to member?
Right.
Well, let's create a contract in which all members are clear about where the boundaries and the rights are. And that is a private box for us to do our business in.
Right.
Then you have the public. Well, the public is not part of that contract. So they can't come in, as you can't go into the farmland, they can't come into your farmland, your contract. So the public is out there. But what I see with people when they start trying to, pull the one into the other, into the other, into the other, then you get a spaghetti bowl, which is this huge mess. And it's really difficult to defend that should the storm come and should you be challenged in court.
So what I think I'm hearing you say, and upon reflection too, is all right. And I want to talk about the bigger ministry in a minute too. But
Sure.
For this situation that we're talking about, that I believe that many people are in, a lot of people are just getting started with this. So they are the one-person show with some trustees. So we've got our container of our contract, our private agreement. It's unincorporated, which is a big deal. We haven't made that agreement with the state.
Right.
And all the people are members. So we've got contract with them. If we, or when we say, okay, I am going to use a tax responsibility, I am going to file, does that bring them into an agreement that would affect their private membership association? Or, like you said, it's kind of in another box that says, here's just my filing responsibility that I'm going to render unto Caesar what I feel is due. I like driving on public roads.
Right. There's various ways of looking at that, and that's where the expertise comes in of a tax advisor. And one of the things I just want to point out for the audience from the beginning, David has said we are not tax advisors.
Right.
Please go and speak to a tax professional, because in every situation it is different. And so they need to do that. But there's various ways in which these things can be structured. For example, in the public, let's say you are a person running an air conditioning company and you need free on gas. Well, the free on gas falls under public regulation. It pre-exists your business. It pre-exists your arrival, right? Those things are in place before you got there. So in that relationship, to satisfy the requirements of the law and the pre-existing constructs that are there, go and create an LLC. And the LLC then enters into that contract with government, and the LLC meets those requirements. Now you get all different ways in which you can do things from there. You may say, look, I really want to support ministry, and I'm going to use the LLC to raise funds for the ministry. Well, then the LLC can simply donate to the ministry.
Right.
Okay, so the ministry still then, because now it's a genuine donation.
Right.
And it's not a quid pro quo that's going backwards and forwards. It's not I'm using the ministry to hide money from the tax man.
Right. Right.
Okay, so there's various ways of doing this. You really need to speak to a professional when it comes to the specialties that are involved.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about then a real, I don't know if real is the right word that I want to use, but a legitimate ministry that's operating with the contracts, the private ministerial association, and the private member agreement, and they have an advisory board and they have decisions, because this was one of the big things in the case, that all the decisions were being made by two people. But now we've got 10, nice number, right? We've got 10 people on that advisory board, and that board is making financial decisions, plus what are we doing with donations, plus what are we doing about events, what are we going to have, what's going on in our ministry, that now if that organization was challenged, they would be able to say, oh, but with all due respect, Your Honor, here's exactly what's going on. Obviously, not their jurisdiction in our private domain land, but Your Honor, here's exactly what went on, and all of these people made the decisions.
Right.
Right.
What you've done is you've removed the individual from sole control.
Yep.
And you've put a distance between the individual, which is the way it should be in the kingdom. If you are genuine and authentic, then you get to a place where you understand that everything does not belong to me. This creation is not mine, it's the Lord's. Eventually, that's where you will eventually get to in your understanding. So everything I do is not for me, so why would I want to hang on to it anyway? Well, the question then comes in, well, what if somebody runs away with the ministry? You know, I spend all this time and effort to build a ministry, and now I elect a board and the board votes me out. And that's where it gets interesting. Now, that's a whole different discussion. But again, there are things, and this is where we start getting into trust, which is a subject. So if there are assets involved or whatever, let's say I'm going into ministry or you are, and you've got property, put it into the trust for your beneficiaries or for your heirs or whatever. But again, what happens in a trust is you have a revocable trust and an irrevocable. Now, revocable means that the person creating the trust can go and revoke it, can turn it around on itself, can cancel the decisions. Problem with that is if this person ends up in court, the court says, we can get through you to that because you control the trust. So an irrevocable trust says, yes, but I don't have control over it. The heirs or the trustees have control over it. So there are ways that one can work around with these things. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. If you come to the table with, we are going to poke the bear in the eye and we are going to show the government how wrong they are, I really caution you against that, because you're going to start bringing in things. You're going to bring a psychology into it. You're going to start looking for tricks and techniques that are going to get you into trouble.
Mhm.
And you're going to then start saying, but this is a PMA, when in fact that's not actually what a PMA is or what it should ever have been.
Right.
PMA is simply just a contract between people concerning themselves, concerning their relationship between each other.
Right. Well, I love this, and I think that if you have the background, if you have background in constitutional law, you have background in tax law, you know you've got this advisory board, you are the chairperson, so that does protect you from the entire board running away with everything because you're the chairperson. There is a decision there. So if you've got all of those things in your gift basket, then maybe you do say, okay, no problem, I'm sleeping at night just fine because I know that I can stand up for myself, right?
Hey everyone, this is a good spot for me to pop in here with these next two slides that have references to case rulings about Section 508C1A and how it does uphold the mandatory exception of many things, including tax responsibilities and filing. I will link these in the video or in the show notes below as well. You can pause the video and read these. And I want to just make it really clear that we're not going back on anything that we have been saying. The Section 508C1A is very real. You can read it for yourself, and you absolutely can use it. What we are doing is presenting information. So again, you can make really wise decisions for where you are. Are you the one-person show with some trustees and you've been curious about this? How exactly does this work? Do I actually have a ministry that would look legitimate if I was challenged? And if you don't, then maybe you do make that decision to show tax responsibility until it moves into the ministry with a board of advisors that helps you make these decisions and determines that the ministry does take care of your living expenses, i.e., that renunciation or denunciation of worldly values and material things, aka the old vow of poverty. So I just wanted to have a little help there, a little more clarity. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far, and keep digging.
But the rest of us may say, well, until I'm able to learn all of those things, or I'm much more interested in being able to do my ministry work in the world than not sleep at night, then we're going to make these wise as serpents decisions and be gentle as doves.
Right. And
Yeah.
this is where I think it's so important to speak with your advisor, get to know your advisor, because you should be on a journey together in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you're seeing your PMA, I need filing documents, book, file it in the filing cabinet, and that's it. No, it's part of a journey. It's part of a journey of you need to get yourself more familiar with constitution, with law, with how things work. It's an ongoing journey of discovery. And each discovery gives you more power, gives you more status, gives you more standing, gives you more clarity as we go down the road.
Thank you for having this conversation.
We could talk more, but I think that's enough for today.
I think that's good. Would you like to tell us what's going on in your ministry and how people can find you?
So I was called into ministry from a very young age, and it's focused on kingdom building. So this is something that when I see things, like when I see PMA and I see what's going on, I get these things really quickly, right?
Right.
And again, it's that picture of walking through the desert. Hey, I found water. You need water. This can make such a difference in your life. We're in a desert land. What if we work together? What if we take the water, connect up a few pipes here? We can now transform this. We can from desert to plantations to whatever. So I see those pictures. I'm a person, I see a lot of those connections, love to help people. I think the greatest way to do that is through the heart of God. Because everything that we try without the heart of God leads us into greed and into competition and into base, just dog-eat-dog mentality, which we've all been taught. And for me, the thing about PMAs is how can we create, with a ministry background, how can we create a sacred sanctuary? How can we create a holy ground for families and friends and for people to work together in the best way with the best intentions possible? And so that kind of summarizes, it's a very practical ministry. We look for practical application, whereas many ministries are theological and so on. I went to, Jesus tells us to pray, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. And so the defining thing that makes this ministry different is that question, what does that look like in practical reality on earth as it is in heaven? And so it's the empoweredkingdom.com, empowered kingdom. The links will be there. You can follow that if you're interested.
I'll put all those links up. Thank you so much for making sense of what can be really complicated. It is delving into constitutional language and case law and legalese. And it takes a lot of time to wrap your minds around that. Especially if you're someone like me who just said, oh, I don't want to know about that until 2.5 years ago. And now it's one of those situations where, oh, look at God's sense of humor. Here we are. So thanks so much for taking the time to use such great visuals for us all and share some of your wisdom.
You're absolutely welcome. It's by God's grace. And so that's where my heart comes from. I just recognize that everything we do is a gift. And I think if we were more appreciative, just as a society, of one another, of the gifts we have, and also of the fact that we can learn things. I mean, it's not as if these things are secret. The knowledge is there.
Right.
So I strongly encourage, if you're a parent, you should start diving into this. This is your children's future.
Yeah.
And start asking them the questions. And you were asking about ministry earlier, but we have programs in development to help parents raise smarter, wiser families and children. Because remember, you're going to get old. And it may be your children who become your protector and your defender. But how can they if they are ignorant and they know nothing?
Yeah.
So just from that point alone, it's so important to bring yourself and your family and community up to speed as far as possible.
Yeah.
So important.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk more, but then we're going to be here another hour. So
I know.
thank you to everybody who's been watching. Much appreciated. God bless you all.
Thank you. And be sure and check out the empoweredkingdom.com. I'll link everything. Like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you in the next video.